Meet Sarah, a 23-year-old dreamer from the bustling streets of Los Angeles. With big plans but an empty bank account, she was determined to turn her modest life into something extraordinary. She wasn't your ordinary girl. No, she had a spark, a fire in her eyes that said, "I'm meant for more." And while her days were spent working a dead-end job, her nights were filled with the fantasies of a life she knew she deserved. Private jets, high fashion, and the kind of love story that only happens in movies. But Sarah had one rule. Love wouldn't come at the cost of her self-respect. Or so she thought. One fateful night, Sarah found herself dressed in a gown she couldn't afford, walking into a room filled with the world's wealthiest and most powerful. The kind of men who didn't just buy yachts, they bought islands. Among them stood him, Zayed al-Fahad, the name whispered in luxury circles like a mythical figure. Handsome, confident, with a smirk that said, "I always get what I want." And for a split second, their eyes met across the glittering hall. She told herself she wasn't the type to fall for such a man, but something about the way he looked at her, like she was a puzzle he couldn't wait to solve, sent shivers down her spine. The kind of shivers she'd been warned about. But who listens to warnings when temptation comes wrapped in silken power? Little did she know one decision that night would change her life forever, and not in the fairy tale way she imagined. Sarah's heart raced as she stepped further into the grand ballroom, a dazzling space dripping in chandeliers, gold accents, and a kind of wealth she had only ever seen on TV. Every corner of the room seemed to whisper luxury. Guests in designer gowns mingled over champagne glasses that cost more than her rent. But Sarah? She didn't belong here. Not really. Her dress was a rental, and her confidence, well, it was barely holding together under layers of cheap foundation. Yet she had mastered the art of pretending. Tonight she was here to make an impression, maybe meet the right person who could finally help her escape her paycheck-to-paycheck life. But fate had other plans. He stood near the grand piano, casually leaning on a polished marble column like he owned the place. Because, let's be honest, he probably did. Zayed al-Fahad. The name alone made Sarah's stomach flutter with an uneasy mix of nerves and curiosity. Everyone knew his reputation. The Middle Eastern billionaire with a fortune so vast, even Forbes couldn't keep track. Zayed wasn't just wealthy, he was intoxicatingly dangerous, the kind of man women dreamed of and feared in equal measure. Stories about him were always swirling. Some whispered he'd built his empire on charm and ruthless cunning. Others claimed he had broken hearts around the globe, leaving a trail of women who never quite recovered. And now his gaze was locked on Sarah. She shifted awkwardly under his intense, smoldering stare. Her first thought was to look away, to blend into the crowd before she embarrassed herself. But then he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that felt like an invitation and a dare all at once. Something about it sent heat rising to her cheeks. How could a single look feel like a promise of passion and a warning of heartbreak? Her body told her to stay. Her brain screamed, "Run." But Sarah wasn't the type to turn down a challenge, especially not one wrapped in a custom-tailored suit and an aura of pure seduction. Within moments, he was at her side, as if the crowd had parted for him like the Red Sea. "You look like you don't belong here," he said, his deep, accented voice laced with amusement. It wasn't a question. Sarah bristled, her nerves igniting with defiance. "And you look like you own the place." His grin widened. "I just might." Her sharp reply seemed to intrigue him. Most women probably fawned over him, she thought, giggling and batting their eyelashes. But Sarah wasn't about to be another notch in his billionaire belt. At least that's what she told herself as the conversation unfolded. Yet the way he spoke, every word calculated and smooth like velvet, made it hard to keep her resolve. "You don't seem the type to settle," Zayed said, his gaze lingering on her lips for just a moment too long. "What is it you're chasing?" "Freedom," Sarah replied without thinking. The word rolled off her tongue with an honesty that surprised even her. "Ah!" Zayed leaned closer, his presence magnetic, intoxicating. "Freedom is expensive, but for the right person, it can be priceless." The air between them shifted, growing heavier with unspoken tension. His words felt loaded, like he was offering her more than just a simple conversation. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. the reality of the moment hitting her like a wave. This wasn't just casual flirting. Zayed saw something in her, something even she hadn't yet uncovered. They spent the rest of the evening talking, much to the annoyance of the other women at the party who had hoped to capture Zayed's attention. He wasn't the cold, arrogant playboy she'd expected. There was depth beneath the confidence, glimpses of vulnerability hidden behind his perfect facade. She found herself laughing at his clever quips, leaning closer when his voice dropped to a low, intimate timbre. But Sarah wasn't naive. She knew men like Zayed didn't chase without a reason. Still, when he offered to drive her home in his limousine, she hesitated. This was her moment to draw a boundary, to show she wouldn't fall at his feet just because he had a private jet and an empire. Yet when he brushed his fingers against hers, an innocent touch that sent fire coursing through her veins, her resolve began to crack. "I had a lovely time tonight," he said, his voice softer now, his charm taking on a different tone. "I hope this won't be the last time we meet, Sarah." Her name on his lips sounded dangerous, almost like a spell she couldn't shake. And when she finally stepped out of the limousine, she couldn't stop thinking about him, his voice, his touch, that unspoken promise in his eyes. Back in her small, cluttered apartment, Sarah stared out the window, the city lights flickering below. The night had left her dizzy and torn. She wanted more of him, of this life he represented. But deep down, she wondered, was she walking into something beautiful or into the kind of chaos she might never escape? One thing was certain, her life wouldn't ever be the same. The days that followed were a whirlwind Sarah hadn't prepared for. She tried to focus on her regular life, her exhausting 9-to-5 job, the noisy neighbors in her rundown apartment complex, and her dream of one day building something bigger for herself. But no matter how hard she tried, Zayed's image kept invading her thoughts. His voice echoed in her mind, smooth and deliberate, and his touch lingered like a phantom reminder of a night that felt too perfect to be real. She didn't have to wonder for long. One evening, just as she was about to collapse on her couch with instant noodles and a cheap bottle of wine, her phone buzzed. The unknown number made her hesitate. She never answered unknown calls, scams, wrong numbers, or worse, someone asking her to pay a bill she already couldn't afford. But something urged her to pick up. "Sarah!" His voice was unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. "How did you get my number?" she asked, a little sharper than she intended. But the mixture of nervousness and excitement bubbling inside her wasn't easy to hide. "When you're someone like me," Zayed said, his tone laced with mischief, "you find that very few things are out of reach, including you." It was the kind of line that should have annoyed her, but instead her lips curled into a small, involuntary smile. "I was wondering if you'd join me for dinner tomorrow night," he continued, as if his request was the simplest thing in the world. "There's something about you, Sarah, that I find intriguing." She hesitated. This was her moment, her chance to decline and take control of whatever was brewing between them. But against her better judgment, she heard herself say, "Dinner? As in just dinner?" His chuckle on the other end of the line sent warmth trickling through her chest. "For now," he replied. The next evening, Zayed didn't just show up. He arrived in grand style. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce purred at the curb of her apartment building, its driver stepping out to open the door. Sarah, dressed in the best outfit she could throw together, tried to fight the nerves gnawing at her. Inside, Zayed was waiting. His traditional Arab attire, accented with modern luxury details, made him look every bit the billionaire she knew him to be. But it was his eyes, dark and full of intent, that sent her heart tumbling over itself. The restaurant wasn't just high-end, it was a fortress of exclusivity, perched high above the city with breathtaking views. It was the kind of place where they didn't hand out menus unless you were someone or with someone who had the power to own the table you sat at. As the night unfolded, Sarah found herself slipping deeper into the spell he seemed to weave so effortlessly. They talked about everything, yet he revealed almost nothing about himself. Whenever she asked about his personal life, he expertly shifted the conversation back to her, peeling back layers she hadn't even known existed. "I see something in you," he said at one point, his eyes locked with hers. "You're not like the others in that room the other night. You're not here to chase riches or fame. You're chasing meaning." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she let herself believe he saw her for who she truly was, a woman driven by passion and ambition, not greed. But a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that men like Zayed didn't give their attention freely. They played games, and the stakes were always higher than they seemed. Sarah had to make a decision: stay and fight for a love that might never truly be hers, or walk away and protect the life she had built for herself. Was Zayed truly what she needed, or had he just been a chapter in her story she was now ready to close? The tension was rising, and as the truth began to settle in, Sarah knew this was the moment that would define her. No more hesitation, no more waiting for someone else to make a choice for her. And just like that, she made her move. But was it the right choice? Only time would tell. Stay tuned to see what happens next. As the evening wore on, Zayed leaned closer, his gaze burning into hers. "You intrigue me, Sarah," he said again, his voice almost a whisper. "And I'm not a man who ignores his instincts. When I want something, I find a way to get it." His words hung in the air, equal parts tempting and dangerous. A part of her wanted to lean in, to explore the undeniable chemistry between them. But another part, the part that still clung to logic and self-preservation, hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was falling into a fairy tale or a trap. When he dropped her off that night, standing at the curb of her apartment once again, Zayed leaned in closer than he had before. "I'll see you again soon, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with certainty. "And next time, I'll show you just how serious I am about you." She watched the car glide away into the night, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. She knew she was getting in too deep, but walking away from Zayed al-Fahad felt impossible. Her phone buzzed moments later, a single text from the unknown number she now recognized. "I told you freedom is expensive, didn't I?" Her breath hitched. What exactly had she gotten herself into? And was it already too late to turn back? Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life became a whirlwind of experiences she could barely believe were real. Lavish dinners, helicopter rides, and gifts that seemed too extravagant to be meant for her. Zayed had a way of making everything feel larger than life, as if the world bent to his will just to accommodate his desires. At first, Sarah reveled in it. After all, who wouldn't enjoy being swept off their feet by a man like Zayed? A man who wasn't just handsome, but seemed to possess an otherworldly confidence, as though nothing and no one could ever tell him no. But as magical as the moments felt, doubts lingered beneath the surface, quietly tugging at her mind when the thrill of the night faded. Zayed was charming, attentive even, but there was something about him that didn't feel entirely transparent. Whenever Sarah asked deeper questions about his family, his business, his past, he expertly redirected the conversation, feeding her just enough charm to distract her from pressing further. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of his penthouse overlooking the city, she finally decided to confront him. "Why me, Zayed?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "There are hundreds of women who would give anything to be with you. Why choose someone like me?" Zayed turned his gaze toward her, the flicker of a smile playing on his lips. "Do you really not see it, Sarah? You're not like them." She tilted her head, unconvinced. "What does that even mean?" He leaned closer, the intensity in his eyes sending shivers down her spine. "The others want the life I can offer, the money, the power, the luxury. But you—" He paused, reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. "You make me feel alive in a way no one else ever has. You're a breath of fresh air in a world that suffocates me." The sincerity in his words was undeniable, and for a moment, Sarah felt her doubts melting away. Maybe she was overthinking things. Maybe Zayed truly did see something special in her. But then came the evening that would change everything. Zayed invited her to a gala, a prestigious event attended by royalty, dignitaries, and some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. It was a night of glamour and sophistication, the kind Sarah had always dreamed of, but never thought she'd be a part of. Yet as dazzling as the night was, something felt off. From the moment they arrived, Sarah noticed the way certain women looked at Zayed, some with longing, others with bitterness. It wasn't just casual glances. There was history in their eyes, stories untold. And then there was the woman who approached their table during dinner. She was stunning, tall, elegant, and exuding an air of confidence that made Sarah immediately feel out of place. She spoke in flawless Arabic, her tone playful yet familiar, and Zayed responded in kind, his expression softening in a way Sarah had never seen before. When Sarah politely asked who she was, Zayed hesitated for just a fraction of a second before replying, Amira, she's an old friend. But Sarah wasn't buying it. The tension between them was too palpable, too charged to be just friendship. Later that night, when they returned to the penthouse, Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. Who is Amira, really? She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and insecurity. And don't tell me she's just a friend. I'm not stupid, Zayed. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as he turned to face her. For the first time, the mask of calm and control he always wore seemed to crack. She's my fiancée, he admitted quietly. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her heart sank, and for a moment, she thought she hadn't heard him correctly. You're… what? It's not what you think, he said quickly, his tone desperate. It's an arrangement, a business deal. Our families expect it. It doesn't mean anything to me. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. She had known there was a side of Zayed's life he hadn't shared with her, but this was more than she could handle. Doesn't mean anything to you? She repeated, her voice breaking. Do you have any idea what this feels like? To be here with you, thinking, hoping, and all the while you're planning a life with someone else? Zayed stepped closer, his expression full of regret. Sarah, listen to me. What I feel for you, what we have, it's real. I've never felt this way about anyone before. If I could walk away from the obligations, I would. But it's not that simple. She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. It's always simple, Zayed. You either choose me or you don't. For the first time, Zayed didn't have a response. And that was the moment Sarah knew. As much as she cared for him, as much as her heart ached to stay, she couldn't compete with a world of expectations and obligations she would never truly belong to. That night, she left Zayed's penthouse, knowing it was the beginning of the end. And though her heart felt shattered, there was a small, stubborn part of her that knew she would survive this, even if it meant walking away from the man who had turned her life upside down. As days passed, Sarah struggled to escape the cloud of confusion and pain hanging over her. She had thought her feelings for Zayed were real. Maybe they were. Maybe they weren't. In the chaos of her emotions, it was impossible to know for sure. But one thing she did know was that she couldn't keep fighting for a place in his world. Not when his life was so filled with layers of complications, obligations, and expectations she could never meet. She kept herself busy, so busy in fact, that it felt like a physical ache to sit down and allow herself to process everything that had happened. Work was still draining. Her small apartment still felt suffocating, but it was all she had left. She threw herself into it, as though her job could erase the sense of loss that followed her every move. Yet Zayed wasn't the type to just disappear. He wasn't the kind of man who took rejection well, especially not when it came from someone he'd become attached to. One evening, after coming home late from work, Sarah found a bouquet of exotic flowers waiting at her doorstep. She stared at them for a moment, not sure whether to laugh or cry. The last time a man had left her flowers, she'd been in her 20s, and even then it had felt more like a gesture out of obligation than genuine affection. But these flowers? They were from Zayed, beautiful, lavish, and with an extravagant note that simply read, I made a mistake. Please talk to me. Z double quote. Part of her wanted to throw the flowers in the trash, to tell him she had moved on and meant what she'd said when she left. But another part of her, much to her dismay, wanted to know why. She wanted to understand how it could be possible for someone like Zayed, who had everything, to suddenly turn to her with raw honesty. That evening, after fighting herself every step of the way, she agreed to meet him. The moment they met in a quiet, secluded cafe, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. His usually impeccable appearance was slightly disheveled, his once pristine suit now looking like he'd rushed through it without any attention to detail. Sarah, he said softly, his voice quieter than usual, I know I don't deserve this, but please, I need you to hear me out. She crossed her arms, maintaining a careful distance. Her voice remained firm. You don't need to say anything, Zayed. I heard enough the other night. You've got obligations, responsibilities, a fiancé. We're not in the same world, and no matter how much I care about you, this can't continue. Not like this. I know, he whispered, his tone full of regret. I was selfish. I let my emotions get the best of me. And for that, I'm sorry. But it's not what you think. It's not about her. I don't love her like that. She's the one I'm supposed to marry, but the woman I'm meant to be with is you. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Is that it then? The good old I was misunderstood and trapped in a life I didn't choose line? Because that's what it sounds like. Number, please, don't say that, Zayed urged, leaning forward in his seat. If you think I haven't thought about this, about losing you, you're wrong. But everything in my life has been arranged for me, Sarah. My family's expectations, my business deals, and Amira. She's part of all of that. But you weren't part of the plan. And that's the problem. His honesty was almost too much for Sarah to handle. Her head felt heavy as his words sank in. He spoke with such emotion, and yet something in her heart resisted believing him. Her mind flashed back to all those moments, the champagne-filled evenings, the private jets, the extravagant gifts. He was a man who always had choices, always in control. Was this real, or was she simply a temporary escape for someone used to getting whatever he wanted? I don't want to be your escape, Zayed, Sarah said, her voice trembling now. I don't want to be the other woman or the secret you hide. I want something real. I want the chance to be myself without living in someone else's shadow. And I need to know, if I walk away, you won't just keep chasing me because it's part of the thrill. He reached across the table and took her hand, something fragile in his touch that she hadn't expected. I swear to you, Sarah, it's not just the thrill, it's you. And I can't bear the thought of losing you. A cold silence descended over them as Sarah wrestled with her emotions. Part of her wanted to forgive him, to allow herself to dive back into this intoxicating world he offered. But another part of her, maybe the stronger part, knew she deserved something more than promises that seemed to shift with the wind. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, she stood up, pulling her hand back from his grip. Zayed, I care about you more than I should, but I'm not the one you need to choose. You know what you have to do. You need to decide, really decide, who you want your future to be with. Zayed stared at her in disbelief. His expression softened, his eyes gleaming with hurt and desperation. But all Sarah felt was a quiet strength building inside her, an overwhelming realization that she was capable of moving forward, on her own. Without another word, she turned and left the cafe, leaving Zayed staring after her with a broken, lost look. It wasn't an easy choice, but as the doors of the cafe closed behind her, Sarah knew she had just taken the first step toward reclaiming her own future. No more living in the shadows of others' expectations. No more chasing a man who was running from the truth. Her own path was calling, and this time, she was determined to walk it alone. After that night, Sarah threw herself fully into her life again. The empty feeling she once had after walking away from Zayed was slowly being replaced with a deep sense of self-worth and purpose. Each day, the fog of doubt lifted a little more, and she remembered the woman she was before he came into her life. Ambitious, independent, and capable of anything she set her mind to. Work became her refuge, not because it was the easiest, but because it allowed her to redirect her thoughts and emotions into something concrete. She became determined to focus on building something of her own, not just financially, but emotionally. And yet, despite all of this, the memory of Zayed lingered like a shadow in her mind. One afternoon, as Sarah walked out of her office building, lost in thought about an upcoming project, she found herself face to face with a very familiar figure. Zayed. His presence was commanding, as always. But today there was something different. His usual confidence appeared to have been replaced with something more vulnerable, almost defeated. For a moment they both stood there, silently assessing each other, before he finally spoke. Sarah, his voice cracked slightly as though unsure if she would even acknowledge him. I know you don't want to see me, and I completely understand that. But can we just talk? Just one last time? For a split second, Sarah wanted to turn and walk away. She had fought so hard to move on, to close that chapter in her life. But the sincerity in his eyes caught her off guard. The man she had once thought was untouchable, controlling the fate of everyone around him, now looked as if he was simply a man caught in the storm of his own decisions. "Why now, Zayed?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but showing signs of the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide. "Why after everything, after all the pain, are you asking to talk to me?" Zayed took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I was wrong, Sarah. I've been so consumed by the idea of control, of having everything laid out for me, families, obligations, expectations, but I never considered what I actually needed, what I wanted, and what I want is you." He reached out, but Sarah instinctively stepped back, her heart racing. "I can't be what you want, Zayed," she said, her voice quiet but her tone firm. "You don't get to come back when it's convenient for you. After everything, you're asking me to trust you again? You think you can just walk into my life and everything will fall into place?" Zayed looked at her with a pained expression. "I don't expect you to just forgive me. I don't even deserve your forgiveness. But Sarah, I need you to know that every day without you has been a waking nightmare. I was so caught up in everything I thought I should be doing that I forgot what mattered most." Sarah could feel the weight of his words, each one hanging in the air like a call for something deeper, but also like a plea for redemption. Yet her own wounds, still tender and raw, screamed at her to protect herself. "Zayed," she began, a deep sadness welling up inside her. "Do you really think I can just forget everything that's happened? This, this isn't just a game. You dragged me into a world that was never meant for me. All the things I thought I could trust, all the promises you made, turned out to be nothing but smoke and mirrors. And I don't think I'm strong enough to keep being your secret, your afterthought. I won't be your escape anymore. I won't be a placeholder." A long, painful silence stretched between them. Zaya didn't say anything for several moments, just staring at her, as if trying to find the right words, or perhaps realizing that he had already lost her. "I understand," Zayed said finally, his voice low, a shadow of the arrogance that once accompanied it, "and I can't ask you to stay. But please, understand that what I feel for you is real. I may not deserve a second chance, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't want one. If I could undo everything, I would." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. Despite everything, despite her pride and her independence, a small part of her still cared, maybe more than she wanted to, and that hurt more than she could have anticipated. "I think you need to figure things out, Zayed," Sarah replied gently, the words coming from a place of sadness rather than anger. "And so do I. We're not right for each other. Not anymore." Zayed nodded, finally understanding the finality in her tone. His shoulders drooped slightly, the weight of their unspoken goodbye hanging between them. For the first time since she'd met him, Sarah felt a mixture of pity and relief. Zayed was no longer the person who controlled her life with a wave of his hand. He was just a man standing before her, asking for a second chance he had no right to ask for. With one last look, Sarah turned and began walking away. It wasn't just walking away from him. It was walking toward herself, towards her future, towards the woman she had been before all of this. Her phone buzzed. A text from a new client. Work was waiting for her, and so was her future. As she walked down the bustling street, the world around her felt suddenly bigger, brighter, more alive. And in that moment, Sarah knew that she had made the right choice, no matter how hard it was to get there. She wasn't going to settle for anything less than the future she deserved, not one tied up in the complicated webs of someone else's making. She was her own woman now, and that was enough. Zayed's shadow faded with each step, and Sarah's confidence grew, piece by piece, as she took control of the life she wanted to create. This was her new beginning. Sarah's life, though still challenging, started to regain the brightness it once had. Each morning, the weight of Zayed's world grew more distant, and the world she was beginning to reclaim slowly fell into place. She was more focused than ever, driven, motivated, and most importantly, not dependent on the validation of someone else. At work, her success was undeniable. She took on bigger projects, her ideas sparkled with creativity, and her efforts never went unnoticed. Colleagues who had once regarded her with mild indifference now sought her advice, impressed by her sharp intellect and growing confidence. It was clear that she had changed, blossomed in ways that she had never thought possible just a few months ago. She had been thrown into an emotional whirlwind, but now she was emerging, stronger than ever. Even her social life flourished. She started spending more time with friends, real friends, people who cared for her, not because of her proximity to luxury or the connections she could offer, but simply because she was Sarah. Her phone was filled with messages of love, laughter, and genuine friendship. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a deep sense of belonging among those who weren't out to use her for their own gain or caught up in illusions of power. Despite all of this, there was a lingering ache, something Sarah had expected to eventually subside, but didn't. She still couldn't seem to shake off the hold that Zayed had once had on her. The part of her heart that had been stolen from him felt broken, but just like everything else in her life now, she refused to give in to it. She found a strange solace in taking time alone for herself. One rainy Saturday afternoon, as the world bustled outside her window, Sarah curled up in her cozy apartment with a book she had been meaning to read. There was something peaceful about the rain, a cleansing sensation that whispered to her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in her journey. And then, just as life seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm, her phone buzzed with a message that she knew would rattle her. "Can we talk, Sarah? Please." It was Zayed. Sarah had to make a decision. Stay and fight for a love that might never truly be hers, or walk away and protect the life she had built for herself. Was Zayed truly? Her heart skipped a beat, as much as she tried not to let it. It had been weeks, weeks of silence, where she convinced herself that she was free. But now here he was, reaching out again, dredging up everything she had been so carefully tucking away. She stared at her phone, biting her lip, torn between her need to ignore him and the curiosity that had quietly rooted itself in her heart. She had left things unsaid. She had questions, so many questions, things that never made sense, doubts that still gnawed at her. But deep down, Sarah also knew that any further contact with him would only risk pulling her back into the same toxic dynamic she had worked so hard to escape. Still, the ache, there it was again. I can't, I can't let you just vanish like this." Zayed's text came next. "I've made mistakes, but I need closure. For us both." Sarah's hand shook slightly as she read his words. A deep sigh escaped her lips. Closure. Did she even want closure from someone like him? Was there anything he could say that would change how things had ended? Did she really want to dive back into the mess he had made? Or was it just the tempting thought of him, the dreamlike fantasy of a life she was supposed to live, that still kept her hooked? After several moments of internal debate, Sarah placed her phone back on the table, away from her reach. For the first time in a long time, she felt a quiet sense of control. She didn't need him to give her closure. She had already found it, in the life she was rebuilding, on her own terms, without relying on Zayed or anyone else to validate her worth. The closure she sought wasn't in his words. It was in the strength she had forged through silence. Through walking away and through making the hard choices, the closure was her own, and she was the one who had the power to shape her future. And so, she resisted. No more late-night texts. No more discussions about what might have been. The woman who was sitting here now wasn't the woman who had come to him seeking something she couldn't find in herself. This new version of Sarah knew that her future wasn't locked in Zayed's hands. It was waiting for her on her own, and she wasn't about to let it slip away again. A couple of hours passed, and a familiar urge, one she had fought for weeks, lingered. She grabbed her phone and typed out a message, unsure of whether it would heal or hurt. After a few moments of thinking, she hit send, the words simple and final. "I don't think we need to talk, Zayed. I've already said everything that needs to be said. We are two different people, living in two different worlds. It's over, and I'm okay with that." There. It was done. This was her closure, the final door closing. She put the phone aside and decided as the rain softly hit the window to enjoy the peace of her own company. She was still young. She still had a lifetime ahead of her to explore, to create, to dream, and she didn't need anyone's permission to begin again. Whatever her future held, she knew one thing for sure. It was hers to define. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah smiled. Her story had just begun. Are you ready for more unexpected twists? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more incredible stories like this one. Don't forget to like, comment, and share if you love the journey. And tell us your thoughts. Could Zayed have changed, or was Sarah right to walk away? Your opinion matters to us.